Power isn't in who commands the room, it's in who refuses to bow. The first thing anyone noticed about Emily Carter wasn't her uniform or the tray balanced steadily in her hands, it was the way she carried herself, like the weight of the world hadn't managed to bend her, not even an inch. The restaurant buzzed with quiet luxury, crystal glasses catching warm light, conversations flowing in low, practiced tones, the kind of place where a single dinner could cost more than her monthly rent. Emily moved through it all with controlled precision, weaving between tables, her eyes always checking, on the guests, on the floor, and most of all, on the small boy seated at the corner booth with a glass of water he held carefully in both hands. Noah didn't speak much, but he watched everything. Especially her. "Mom," he had asked earlier, his voice soft but certain, "why don't you ever let people push you around?" She had smiled then, brushing his hair back, steady and calm. "Because once you kneel for the wrong reason, it's hard to stand up again." Now, as the double doors at the entrance opened, the entire atmosphere shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But it was immediate. Conversations dipped. Movements slowed. Even the air seemed to tighten as Adrian Volkov stepped inside. He didn't need to announce himself. Power followed him like a shadow. Tall, composed, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who never had to ask twice. People noticed. People always noticed. Emily did too, but only for a second. Then she kept walking. Because rent was due in 4 days, and Noah needed new shoes, and noticing powerful men didn't change either of those things. She approached table 12, balancing a tray of red wine glasses, her focus locked, her steps measured. Behind her, the manager's voice cut low and sharp. "Careful. That's his table." Too late. It happened in a blink, a slight shift, a brush of movement from a passing guest, the tray tilting just enough. A single glass tipped. Then another. Deep red spilled across the white tablecloth, and onto the sleeve of Adrian Volkov's suit. Silence didn't fall. It snapped. Emily froze. The room held its breath. The manager rushed forward, face tight with panic, voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "Get down," he hissed. "Apologize properly." Emily didn't move. Her eyes flicked, once, to Noah. He was already looking at her. Waiting. The memory of his question echoed louder than the silence around her. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray. Then slowly, deliberately, she set it down. And stood straight. Not defiant. Not loud. Just unbent. The manager's voice sharpened. "I said kneel." But Emily Carter didn't kneel. And across the table, Adrian Volkov finally looked at her, really looked, like he had just found something in a room full of everything he could already own. No one moved. Not the servers, not the guests, not even the manager whose hand still hovered in the air as if he could force her down by sheer will. The silence stretched long enough to feel deliberate, like something unseen was deciding what happened next. Emily kept her shoulders squared, her breathing steady, though her pulse pressed hard against her ribs. She did not look away. Not from the table. Not from the man standing in front of her. Adrian Volkov studied her in a way that made the room feel smaller, like everything outside that moment had quietly disappeared. He did not react immediately, and somehow that was worse than anger. The manager swallowed, stepping closer, lowering his voice but not enough to hide the urgency. "Sir, I apologize. She will correct this right now." He reached toward Emily again, fingers tense, ready to force compliance. That was when Adrian finally spoke. "Stop." One word. Calm. Controlled. Final. The manager froze mid-step. The authority in that single syllable did not need volume. It carried anyway. Adrian's gaze shifted, not to Emily, but to the man who had tried to make her kneel. "You seem confused," he said quietly. The manager blinked, uncertain. "Sir, I was only trying to maintain." "You were trying to make a mother kneel in front of her child," Adrian interrupted, his tone unchanged, but the weight behind it unmistakable. A ripple moved through the nearby tables. Subtle. Curious. Careful. The kind of attention that did not want to be noticed. Emily felt it too, but she did not turn. She only heard Noah shift slightly in his seat, the faint scrape of his shoe against the floor. Adrian took a slow step around the table, his movements measured, his presence drawing every eye without effort. He stopped beside Emily, close enough that she could sense the quiet control in the way he carried himself, but he did not touch her. He did not need to. "Look at her," he said, not raising his voice, but directing it with precision. The manager hesitated, then obeyed. Adrian continued, "She made a mistake. It happens." A pause. Then softer, sharper. "What does not happen is forcing someone to trade their dignity for your comfort." The word settled heavily into the room. No one interrupted. No one dared. The manager's face shifted, color draining just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath his authority. I did not mean." "Intent does not change the moment," Adrian replied. His eyes flicked briefly toward Noah, who was watching everything now, wide-eyed but still, as if he understood more than anyone expected. Something in Adrian's expression changed then. Not softer. Not weaker. Just, aware. He turned back to the manager. "You will apologize." The statement was not loud. It was not aggressive. But it left no room for interpretation. The manager hesitated for half a second too long. Then he lowered his head slightly, turning toward Emily. "I am sorry," he said, the words tight, unfamiliar on his tongue. Emily blinked once. That was all. She did not smile. She did not thank him. She simply acknowledged it with a small, controlled nod, as if accepting the apology without surrendering anything else. Adrian watched that exchange carefully, as though measuring something invisible. Then his gaze returned to Emily, and for the first time, there was something different behind it. Not possession. Not curiosity. Something closer to respect. "Finish your shift," he said quietly. Not a command. Not quite a suggestion. Something in between. Then he stepped back, reclaiming the space around him, the room slowly exhaling as conversation began to return in cautious waves. But nothing felt the same. Not the lighting. Not the voices. Not the air. Because Emily Carter had not knelt. And somehow, the most powerful man in the room had made sure everyone else understood why that mattered. The rest of the night did not return to normal, even though everyone pretended it had. Emily moved through the dining room with the same steady pace, the same controlled movements, but she could feel the shift in every glance that lingered a second too long, in every whisper that stopped when she passed. People were watching her now, not as staff, but as something they could not quite place. And across the room, Adrian Volkov remained at his table, but he was not eating. He was observing. Not constantly, not obviously, but enough that every time Emily entered his line of sight, something in the air tightened again. She focused on her work. Orders, plates, glasses, timing. That was how she stayed grounded. That was how she kept everything else from slipping. When she reached the corner booth, Noah looked up at her immediately, his small hands wrapped around the same glass of water he had barely touched. "You did not kneel," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement he needed to hear out loud. Emily crouched slightly so she was at his level, her voice low and calm. "No, I did not." He studied her for a moment, then nodded once, like something important had just been confirmed. "Good," he said, and went back to tracing invisible patterns on the table with his finger. Emily exhaled slowly, a breath she had been holding longer than she realized, then stood and returned to the floor. Hours passed in a blur of controlled motion and quiet tension. By the time the last guests began to leave, the lights felt softer, the room less imposing, like the illusion of power had dimmed just enough to reveal the people underneath it. Emily was wiping down a table near the back when she noticed him again. Not seated. Not surrounded. Standing alone near the exit, as if he had been waiting for something. Or someone. She hesitated for half a second, then continued working. If he wanted something, he would say it. Men like him always did. The manager passed by her quickly, avoiding eye contact now, his earlier authority reduced to careful distance. That alone told her more than any apology had. She finished the last table, set the cloth aside, and reached for her bag. Emily Carter. The sound of her name stopped her mid-motion. Not loud. Not demanding. But precise. She turned. Adrian stood a few feet away, hands relaxed at his sides, his expression unreadable in the dimmer light of closing hours. Up close, he looked less like a figure people whispered about and more like someone who carried too much control to ever show anything else. "Your shift is over," he said. It was. Not a question. Emily nodded once. Yes. A pause settled between them. Not awkward. Just measured. He glanced briefly toward the booth where Noah was now standing, waiting patiently with his small backpack slung over one shoulder. "He watches you carefully," Adrian said. Emily followed his gaze, her expression softening for the first time that night. "He learns from what he sees." Adrian looked back at her, something thoughtful passing through his eyes, like he was turning that idea over in his mind. "Most people teach their children to survive," he said quietly. "You are teaching him something else." Emily met his gaze directly, unflinching. "I am teaching him not to lose himself while doing it." Another pause. This one longer. Deeper. The kind that felt like it held more than words. Adrian gave a small nod, almost to himself. Then he reached into his jacket and placed a simple card on the table beside her. No flourish. No explanation. "If you ever need a place where no one asks you to kneel," he said, his voice low, controlled, "that number will reach me." Emily looked at the card, then back at him. "I do not need saving." Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, not offended, not amused, just aware. "I did not offer to save you," he replied. "I offered to make sure no one mistakes your strength for something they can control." He stepped back then, the distance returning between them as naturally as it had closed. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, the door opening before he reached it, the night beyond swallowing him just as quietly as he had arrived. Emily stood there for a moment, the card untouched on the table, Noah already at her side, looking up at her with quiet curiosity. "Who was that?" he asked. Emily glanced once more at the door, then down at the card. "Someone who noticed," she said softly. But as she slipped the card into her bag, she knew that noticing was never simple when it came from a man like him. And something told her, this was not the last time their worlds would cross. The night air felt different once they stepped outside, cooler, quieter, like the world beyond the restaurant did not care about power or reputation or who had stood their ground inside those walls. Emily adjusted Noah's jacket, pulling it closer around him as a light breeze moved through the empty street. The city was still awake, but softer now, the distant hum of traffic blending into the background like a steady reminder that life kept moving no matter what had happened. Noah looked up at her as they walked toward the bus stop, his small hand slipping into hers. "He was not like the others," he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful in a way that did not belong to a 6-year-old. Emily glanced down at him briefly. "No," she replied, her tone even. "He was not." Noah walked in silence for a few more steps, then added, "He listened." That made her pause, just slightly, her steps slowing before she continued forward. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "people listen when something surprises them." Noah considered that, then nodded, satisfied with the answer, though Emily was not sure she believed it herself. When they reached the bus stop, the bench was empty, the streetlight above flickering faintly, casting uneven shadows across the pavement. She sat down, pulling Noah close to her side, her bag resting beside her. The card was still inside it. She could feel its presence without touching it, like a quiet weight she had not asked for. She told herself it meant nothing. Just a piece of paper. Just a number. But something about the way he had said those words stayed with her, not as a promise, not as a threat, but as something unresolved. The bus arrived with a low hiss of brakes, doors opening slowly. They climbed on, Emily guiding Noah to a seat near the middle, away from the few scattered passengers. The ride home was quiet. City lights passed by the window in blurred streaks, reflections dancing across the glass as Noah leaned his head against her arm. Within minutes, his breathing slowed, his body relaxing into sleep, the tension of the long evening finally catching up to him. Emily watched the reflection of her own face in the window, faint and distant, layered over the moving lights outside. She looked the same. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything felt slightly off balance, like a shift had happened somewhere beneath the surface that she could not quite define. When the bus stopped near their apartment, she gently woke Noah, guiding him off and up the narrow sidewalk toward their building. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and something cooked hours ago, familiar and grounding. Inside their small apartment, everything was exactly where she had left it. The worn couch. The tiny kitchen. The stack of unpaid bills on the counter. Reality, waiting patiently for her to return. She helped Noah change, tucked him into bed, and sat beside him for a moment, watching as he drifted back into sleep. His face was peaceful, untouched by the weight of the world she spent every day navigating. "You did good tonight," he murmured, half asleep. Emily smiled faintly, brushing his hair back. "So did you." When she finally stood and moved to the kitchen, the silence of the apartment wrapped around her, heavier than before. She set her bag down on the counter, hesitating for a second before reaching inside. The card slid into her fingers, simple, unremarkable, except for the name printed across it. Adrian Volkov. No title. No explanation. Just a number beneath it. She stared at it longer than she meant to, her thumb brushing lightly over the edge. Then, with a quiet exhale, she placed it on the counter and stepped away, as if creating distance could make it less significant. But even as she turned off the light and moved toward her room, something in her mind lingered on that moment in the restaurant. Not the mistake. Not the silence. But the way power had shifted without force. The way respect had been given, not taken. And somewhere deep down, a thought she did not fully trust began to form. Not all power demanded submission. Some of it recognized strength when it saw it. And that kind of power did not walk away easily. Morning arrived too quickly, like the night had not fully finished saying what it needed to say. Emily woke before the alarm, staring at the ceiling for a few seconds longer than usual, her mind already moving through the quiet list of responsibilities waiting for her. Bills. Groceries. Noah's school form she had forgotten to sign. The rhythm of survival did not pause for reflection. It never had. She moved through the small apartment with practiced efficiency, preparing breakfast, packing Noah's bag, tying his shoes while he leaned against her knee, still half asleep. Everything felt familiar. Grounded. Safe. And yet, when she reached for her bag near the counter, her eyes flicked, just once, to the card still lying where she had left it. She had not thrown it away. She had not hidden it. It simply remained. Like a question she had not answered. Noah noticed it too. He always noticed more than she expected. "Are you going to call him?" he asked, his voice quiet but direct as he sat at the table, spoon paused halfway to his mouth. Emily did not answer immediately. She picked up the card, turned it once between her fingers, then set it back down exactly where it had been. "No, she said simply. Noah studied her face, searching for something deeper in that answer. Why not? He asked. Emily met his eyes, steady and calm. Because needing help and choosing it are not the same thing. Noah frowned slightly, not fully understanding, but he nodded anyway, trusting her explanation the way he always did. The walk to school was quiet, the morning air crisp, the city already beginning to fill with movement and noise. Parents, commuters, cars lining the streets. Normal life. Emily held Noah's hand as they crossed the intersection, her grip firm but gentle. When they reached the school gate, he turned to her, hesitating for a moment before stepping forward. You are still strong, he said, as if he needed to confirm it again in the daylight. Emily smiled faintly, brushing his shoulder. So are you. She watched him disappear inside, blending into the flow of children and teachers, then turned and began the walk toward the bus stop that would take her back to the restaurant. Another shift. Another night. But as she approached the corner, something felt different. Not loud. Not obvious. Just, intentional. A black car sat parked across the street, engine off, windows dark. It was not unusual. Not in this city. Not in this neighborhood. And yet, as Emily walked past, she felt it, the subtle awareness of being seen. Not followed. Not threatened. Observed. She did not slow down. Did not look directly at it. She kept walking, her posture unchanged, her step steady. Because reacting would mean acknowledging something she was not ready to define. The bus arrived, doors opening with the same familiar hiss, and she stepped inside without turning back. But the feeling stayed with her. Quiet. Persistent. By the time she reached the restaurant later that afternoon, the building looked exactly as it always did. Polished. Controlled. Unaffected. Inside, the manager barely glanced at her as she clocked in, his earlier confidence replaced by careful distance, as though something unspoken had shifted his place in the world. Emily tied her apron, adjusted the tray in her hands, and stepped onto the floor. Everything looked the same. But it was not. Because somewhere between last night and this morning, something had changed in the way she was seen. And in the way she was being watched. And though she had not called the number, had not asked for anything, had not taken a single step toward that world, it had already taken one toward her. The shift started like any other, but it did not feel like any other. Emily noticed it in the way conversations dipped slightly when she passed, in the way the staff gave her more space than usual, like an invisible line had been drawn around her overnight. Respect did not always arrive with words. Sometimes it arrived as silence. She moved through the dining room with the same measured rhythm, balancing trays, delivering orders, her focus steady. But beneath it, something else was building. Awareness. Not fear. Not yet. Just the quiet sense that something had shifted beyond her control. By the time the evening crowd settled in, the restaurant was full again, lights glowing warm against polished surfaces, glasses clinking softly in the background. Emily kept her head down, her movements precise, refusing to let the weight of attention slow her pace. That was when she noticed the table near the back. Not the guests. The absence of noise around them. For men sat there, dressed well but not showy, their posture relaxed but too still, their eyes not quite matching the flow of the room. They were not regulars. They were not tourists. They were watching. Not the menu. Not the room. Her. Emily did not react. She adjusted her grip on the tray and continued walking, but her senses sharpened instantly, every detail registering without effort. One of the men leaned back slightly, his gaze following her as she passed, not openly threatening, but deliberate. Calculating. She had seen that look before. Not here. Not in this place. But she recognized it anyway. The manager approached her a few minutes later, his voice low and uneasy. Table 14, he said. nodding subtly toward the men. Just, be careful. Emily met his eyes for a brief second. He was not giving orders this time. He was warning her. That alone told her everything she needed to know. She nodded once and picked up a fresh tray, her steps controlled as she approached the table. The men fell silent the moment she arrived, their attention focusing on her in a way that felt heavier than the rest of the room combined. "Good evening," she said calmly, her voice even, professional. "What can I get for you?" One of them smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Just water for now," he replied, his tone casual, but his gaze lingering too long. Emily held that moment for exactly 1 second. Then she nodded and turned away. No hesitation. No reaction. But her heartbeat had shifted, just slightly faster, just enough to remind her that something was no longer normal. As she walked back toward the service station, she felt it again. That awareness. Stronger now. Like the room had tilted just a degree off balance. She placed the tray down, reached for the glasses, and forced her hands to remain steady. This was not about fear. This was about control. And she was not going to lose it. When she returned to the table, the men were still watching her, still too quiet, still too focused. She set the glasses down one by one, the soft clink of glass against with the only sound breaking the tension. Then, without warning, one of them spoke again. "You are the one from last night," he said, not asking, but stating. Emily paused for half a second. Then she looked at him. Not submissive. Not challenging. Just steady. "I work here," she replied. The man smiled again, slightly wider this time. "Yes," he said slowly. "We noticed." The words hung there, heavier than they should have been. Emily did not respond. She turned and walked away, her posture unchanged, her pace even. But inside, something had locked into place. This was no longer just about a moment in a restaurant. This was something else. Something that had followed her from last night into this one. And somewhere, just beyond what she could see, a decision had already been made. She just had not been told what it was yet. Emily did not look back at the table, but she could feel it, the weight of their attention pressing against her shoulders even as she moved through the restaurant like nothing had changed. That was the key. Nothing changes unless you let it. She repeated that silently as she picked up another order, her hands steady, her breathing even. Control was not about force. It was about refusal. Refusal to react. Refusal to give someone else the satisfaction of seeing you shift. But the room had already shifted. She noticed it in the way the usual noise did not fully return around table 14, like a pocket of tension existed there that no one wanted to step into. Even the other servers avoided it, their paths curving subtly away, leaving that section almost isolated. Emily did not avoid it. She could not. Avoidance was a kind of surrender, and she had already made her choice the night before. When she returned to the service station, she found the manager standing there, his posture tighter than usual, his eyes flicking toward the back of the room before settling on her. "You do not have to take that table," he said quietly, his voice lacking the authority it once carried. Emily paused, setting down a tray with careful precision. "It is my section," she replied simply. The manager hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Those men, they are asking questions." Emily met his gaze, calm, unreadable. "About what?" "About you." The words hung there for a moment. Not loud. Not dramatic. But heavy enough to change the air between them. Emily did not respond right away. She reached for a clean cloth, wiping a spot that did not need wiping, giving herself a second to think. Not react. Think. "People ask questions all the time," she said finally, her tone even. "It does not mean they deserve answers." The manager exhaled slowly, like he wanted to say more but did not know how. That was the difference now. He was not in control of this situation. Neither was she. Not entirely. Emily picked up another tray and turned back toward the dining room. As she stepped out, she saw it immediately. One of the men from table 14 had stood up and was now walking slowly toward her direction, not hurried, not aggressive, just intentional. The kind of movement that expected space to be made without asking for it. Emily did not step back. She did not speed up. She kept walking, her posture straight, her eyes forward, until the distance between them closed naturally. He stopped just short of her path, forcing a pause without touching her. "You are very composed," he said, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond them. Emily held his gaze, her expression neutral. "It is part of the job." The man smiled slightly, tilting his head as if considering her answer. "No," he said softly. "That is not something a job teaches." Emily did not respond. Silence was sometimes the strongest answer. The man studied her for a second longer, then leaned just enough to lower his voice further. "You should be careful," he added. "Attention like this does not come without a reason." Emily's eyes did not waver. "Then whoever is giving it should be careful too," she replied calmly. The smile faded from his face, not replaced by anger, but by something more measured. Respect, perhaps. Or recognition. He straightened, stepping aside this time, allowing her to pass. But as she moved forward, she felt it again. That shift. Not just from them. From something beyond them. Something larger. And for the first time since last night, a single thought moved through her mind, quiet but undeniable. This was not random. And if it was not random, then someone was watching this unfold exactly as it was meant to. Emily kept walking, her pace unchanged even after the man stepped aside, but the air around her no longer felt like something she could ignore. It was no longer just attention. It was pressure. Quiet, controlled, but deliberate. The kind that built without warning and did not leave without purpose. She returned to the service station, placing the tray down with careful precision, her fingers steady even as her thoughts sharpened beneath the surface. This was not about curiosity. People like those men did not sit for hours just to observe a waitress. They were waiting. For what, she did not yet know. The manager hovered nearby again, restless, his eyes darting between her and the back of the room. "They have not ordered anything else," he muttered under his breath. "They are just sitting there." Emily wiped her hands slowly, her voice calm. "Then they are not here for the food." The manager swallowed, clearly unsettled by the obvious truth. Before he could respond, the front door opened again. This time, the shift in the room was immediate. Not subtle. Not quiet. It moved through the space like a silent command, conversations lowering, posture adjusting, attention redirecting without a single word being spoken. Emily felt it before she saw him. Adrian Volkov stepped inside, his presence cutting through the tension that had been building all night, not with force, but with certainty. The men at table 14 noticed him instantly. Their stillness changed, just slightly, like a calculation had been interrupted. One of them leaned forward, murmuring something under his breath to the others. For the first time since they arrived, they were not watching Emily. They were watching him. Adrian did not acknowledge them. Not directly. He moved through the restaurant with the same controlled pace as before, his gaze sweeping once across the room, taking in everything without appearing to linger on anything. When his eyes reached Emily, they held for a fraction longer. Not by accident. Not unnoticed. Then he continued walking. Emily did not move. For a brief second, the tension in the room shifted direction, like a current reversing. Whatever had been building around her, now had another focus. Adrian stopped near the center of the room, turning slightly as if considering something, then spoke without raising his voice. "You have been sitting here for 40 minutes, he said, his words directed toward table 14, calm but precise. If you are not here to dine, then you are here for something else. The room went completely still. The men exchanged quick glances, the balance they had tried to control now slipping just enough to expose it. The one who had spoken to Emily earlier stood slowly, his expression measured. "We are simply observing," he replied. Adrian's gaze did not change. "Then observe from somewhere else." It was not a threat. It was not raised. But it did not leave room for negotiation. The man held his stare for a moment longer, weighing something invisible, then gave a small nod. Not submission. Not quite. But close enough. One by one, the men stood, their chairs sliding back quietly, their presence dissolving as they moved toward the exit. No scene. No resistance. Just departure. But as they passed Emily, the same man paused for half a second, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "This is not over," he said softly. Then he walked away. The door closed behind them, and just like that, the pressure in the room lifted. Not completely. But enough for people to breathe again. Emily remained still for a moment, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. Then she turned. Adrian was already looking at her. Not with urgency. Not with concern. But with something deeper. Recognition. Like he had just confirmed something he already suspected. Emily held his gaze, unshaken, her posture the same as it had been the night before. She did not thank him. She did not speak. Because this was not about being saved. And somehow, he seemed to understand that without a single word being said. The door closed behind the men, and for a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to breathe again, like tension had been holding the room in place and had finally loosened its grip. Glasses clinked softly. Conversations returned, hesitant at first, then steady. But Emily knew better than to believe it was over. People like that did not leave because they were told to. They left because they chose to. And choice meant intention. She picked up a tray, her movements controlled, her expression unchanged, but her awareness sharper than ever. Across the room, Adrian had not moved. He stood exactly where he had been, his posture relaxed, but his presence still shaping the space around him without effort. He was not watching the door. He was watching her. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that acknowledged it. Emily approached the nearest table, setting down plates, refilling glasses, continuing her work as if nothing had happened. That was the only way forward. Routine. Control. But when she turned back toward the center of the room, Adrian was already there, closer now, the distance between them gone without her noticing him cross it. "They will come back," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond her. Emily did not flinch. She set the tray down, her eyes meeting his directly. People usually do when they have not finished what they started. Adrian studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing through his gaze. "You are not surprised." "Should I be?" she asked calmly. A faint shift touched his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest he found the answer interesting. "Most people would be," he replied. Emily shrugged slightly, the movement minimal but deliberate. "Most people do not get watched like that without a reason." A brief silence settled between them, not empty, but measured, like both of them were choosing their next words carefully. Around them, the restaurant continued its slow return to normal, but the space between them felt separate from it, like a different conversation was happening beneath the surface. Adrian glanced once toward the entrance, then back at her. "You have a child," he said, not as a question. Emily's posture did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened just slightly. "Yes." "Then this is not just about you." His tone remained even, but the meaning behind it was clear. Emily held his gaze, unshaken. "It never is." Another pause. Longer this time. Adrian nodded once, as if confirming something internally. Then you understand why this matters. Emily crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, just grounded. I understand that someone decided to pay attention, she said. What I do not understand is why you are involved. The question hung between them, direct and unapologetic. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her the way he had the night before, like he was measuring something that could not be easily defined. Because I do not ignore things that should not exist in my space, he said finally. Emily tilted her head slightly. And I am one of those things. A subtle shift in his expression. This time, unmistakable. No, he said. You are the reason they do. The words landed quietly, but they carried weight. Emily did not respond right away. She let the silence sit, let the meaning settle without rushing to fill it. Across the room, a glass shattered somewhere in the distance, the sound sharp but brief, quickly absorbed by the returning noise of the restaurant. Life continuing. As if nothing had changed. But everything had. Emily reached for her tray again, lifting it with steady hands. Then it sounds like this is your problem, she said calmly. Adrian's gaze held hers for a second longer, then he nodded once, slow and certain. It is, he replied. And for the first time since he had walked in, there was something different in his voice. Not control. Not authority. Something closer to a decision already made. Emily turned and walked away, her steps even, her posture unbroken. But as she moved through the room, one thought settled clearly in her mind. This was no longer just attention. It was involvement. And involvement always came with a cost. Emily moved through the rest of her shift with the same steady rhythm, but the weight of what had just been said stayed with her, not as fear, but as clarity. Something had changed the moment Adrian decided this was his problem. And people like him did not involve themselves halfway. By the time the last table cleared and the lights dimmed slightly for closing, the restaurant felt quieter than usual, not just in sound, but in energy. The kind of quiet that came after something important had already happened. Emily wiped down the final table, her movements precise, her thoughts measured. She did not rush. She never rushed. Rushing meant reacting, and reacting meant losing control. When she finally untied her apron and reached for her bag, she noticed him again. Not in the center of the room this time. Not surrounded by attention. Standing near the exit, exactly where he had been the night before. Waiting. Not for the room. For her. Emily paused for half a second, then walked toward him, her posture unchanged, her steps even. When she stopped a few feet away, the silence between them felt deliberate, like both of them understood that whatever came next would matter. You stayed, she said simply. Adrian's expression did not shift. So did you. A brief pause. Then Emily tilted her head slightly. You usually take responsibility for things that are not yours. Adrian's gaze held hers, steady, unreadable. Only when they are placed in my world without permission. Emily let that settle for a moment, then nodded once. And what happens next? She asked. This time, Adrian did not answer immediately. He looked past her, through the glass doors, into the night beyond, like he was considering something larger than the conversation itself. Next, he said quietly, they decide whether they made a mistake. Emily crossed her arms lightly, her expression calm. And if they did not? Adrian turned back to her, his eyes sharp now, focused. Then I decide for them. The words were not loud. Not aggressive. But they carried a certainty that did not need explanation. Emily studied him for a moment, searching for something. Beneath that certainty. Not weakness. Not hesitation. But intention. You do not know me, she said. No, Adrian replied. But I know what I saw. Another pause. The kind that did not feel empty. And what was that? Emily asked. Adrian's gaze did not waver. Someone who does not bend when it matters. The answer came without hesitation. Without doubt. Emily looked at him for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. That does not make me part of your world, she said calmly. Adrian's expression remained composed, but something in his eyes shifted, just slightly. No, he said. But it makes you visible to it. The word settled heavier than anything else he had said. Because visibility was not always a choice. And it was rarely without consequence. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, its headlights cutting briefly through the glass before disappearing into the distance. Emily adjusted her grip on her bag, grounding herself in the simple, familiar motion. I do not need protection, she said quietly. Adrian nodded once, as if he expected that answer. Good, he replied. Because this is not about protection. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. Then what is it about? Adrian held her gaze, his voice low, controlled. It is about making sure the wrong people learn the right lesson. Silence followed. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just, complete. Emily exhaled slowly, then stepped past him, moving toward the door without looking back. But just before she reached it, she stopped. Not turning. Not hesitating. Just enough to speak. Make sure you are not teaching the wrong one, she said calmly. Then she pushed the door open and stepped into the night. Adrian did not follow. He did not need to. Because as he watched her walk away, one thing had already become clear. This was not a situation he would walk away from. And whether she wanted it or not, she was already part of what came next. The night air did not feel the same as it had the day before. It was not colder. Not quieter. But heavier, like something unseen had settled into place and was waiting to see what she would do next. Emily walked with steady steps, her hand tightening slightly around the strap of her bag, her eyes forward, her pace unchanged. Routine was control. Control was survival. But awareness followed her now, subtle and persistent, like a shadow that did not belong to her. When she reached her apartment building, she paused for a fraction of a second before stepping inside, her senses adjusting automatically. The hallway was the same. Dim lighting. Faint echoes. Nothing out of place. And yet, she still checked. Always checked. Upstairs, the door clicked shut behind her with a familiar sound, grounding her instantly. Noah was already asleep on the couch, curled beneath a thin blanket, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Emily softened at the sight, her posture easing for the first time that night. She set her bag down quietly, brushing a hand through his hair before lifting him gently and carrying him to bed. He stirred slightly, murmuring something she could not fully catch, but his hand instinctively reached for her sleeve before relaxing again. She stayed there a moment longer than usual, watching him, memorizing the calm on his face like she always did after a long shift. Then she stepped away. Back into the quiet. The apartment felt smaller tonight. Not physically. But in the way silence pressed against the walls. Emily moved to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, her thoughts replaying the evening with careful precision. The men. Their words. The way they had left. The way Adrian had stepped in without hesitation. This was no longer coincidence. It was sequence. Cause and effect. And she was in the middle of it. Her eyes drifted to the counter. The card was still there. Exactly where she had left it. She stared at it for a long moment, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the counter. She did not reach for it. Not yet. Because picking it up meant acknowledging something she had been avoiding. Dependence. And that was not something she allowed easily. A faint sound broke the silence. Not loud. Not sudden. Just, wrong. Emily's head turned slightly, her body going still without thinking. It came from outside. A car door. Slow. Deliberate. Not the random noise of the city. Not at this hour. Her eyes moved toward the window, but she did not step closer. Instead, she listened. Another sound. Footsteps. Measured. Not rushing. Not wandering. Approaching. Every instinct sharpened instantly. Emily moved without hesitation, crossing the room quietly, checking the lock on the door, then stepping back just enough to keep distance without losing sight of it. She did not panic. Panic wasted energy. This was something else. Something controlled. The footsteps stopped. Right outside. Silence followed. Thick. Waiting. Emily's breathing slowed, her focus narrowing to a single point. Then, a knock. Not loud. Not aggressive. 2 firm taps against the door. Nothing more. Emily did not move. She did not answer. Not immediately. Her eyes flicked once toward Noah's room, then back to the door. The knock came again. Same rhythm. Same control. Whoever it was, they were not in a hurry. That was what made it worse. Emily stepped closer, just enough to reach the door, her voice steady when she spoke. "Who is it?" A pause. Then a voice. Calm. Familiar. "Someone making sure you got home safely." Emily's expression did not change, but something in her chest tightened just slightly. Because she recognized that voice. Adrian Volkov. She stood there for a moment, her hand resting near the lock, her mind already moving through possibilities, outcomes, decisions. Then slowly, she reached for the handle. Not out of trust. Not out of fear. But because not opening the door would not stop what had already started. And she knew it. Emily did not open the door immediately. Her hand rested against the handle, her breathing slow, controlled, her mind moving through every possibility with quiet precision. Outside, Adrian did not knock again. He did not speak. He simply waited. That told her more than anything else. He was not here to force anything. He was here because he had already decided this mattered. And people like him did not arrive without reason. Slowly, she unlocked the door and pulled it open just enough to see him. Adrian stood exactly where she expected him to be, composed, still, the dim hallway light outlining his presence without softening it. He looked the same as he had in the restaurant. Controlled. Certain. But here, in the narrow space outside her apartment, something about that control felt closer. More real. Emily did not step back. She did not invite him in. She simply stood there, holding the space between them with the same quiet strength he had already recognized. "You followed me," she said calmly. Not accusing. Not surprised. Just stating a fact. Adrian met her gaze without hesitation. "I made sure you were not followed," he corrected. Emily studied him for a second, measuring the difference between those two statements. It was small. But not insignificant. "That is not your responsibility," she replied. Adrian's expression did not shift. "It became my responsibility the moment they decided it was not just about you." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear, but in focus. "And how do you know that?" A brief pause. Then, quietly, "Because I know who they are." The words landed with weight. Not dramatic. Not loud. But undeniable. Emily held his gaze, searching for something beneath the surface. "And?" she asked. Adrian glanced briefly down the hallway, then back at her, his voice lowering just enough to carry only between them. "And they do not sit in places like that unless they are looking for leverage." Emily's posture remained steady, but something inside her shifted. Not panic. Not fear. Clarity. Leverage for what? Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved past her for the first time, toward the quiet interior of the apartment, toward the closed door where Noah slept. It was subtle. But Emily saw it. And that was enough. Her body shifted slightly, not backward, but enough to block that line of sight. A silent boundary. Adrian noticed. Of course he did. His gaze returned to her instantly, and something in his expression changed. Not offense. Respect. That is why I am here, he said quietly. Emily did not respond right away. She let the silence sit, let the meaning settle fully before speaking again. You said this is not about protection, she reminded him. Adrian nodded once. It is not. Then what is it? Emily asked, her voice steady. Adrian held her gaze, his answer coming without hesitation this time. It is about control. The word hung in the air between them. Emily's expression did not change, but her voice sharpened just slightly. I am not something you control. Adrian's response was immediate. I know. A pause. Then, more quietly, but the situation is. Emily considered that, her mind already working through what it meant. Control did not always mean ownership. Sometimes it meant influence. Direction. Containment. She exhaled slowly, her grip on the door relaxing just slightly. And what happens if I do nothing? She asked. Adrian's gaze did not waver. Then they decide what happens next. Another pause. Longer this time. He did not push. He did not step forward. He simply waited. Giving her the space to decide. Emily looked at him, really looked this time, not at the suit, not at the presence, but at the intention behind it. Then her eyes flicked briefly toward the counter behind her. Toward the card she had not touched. Toward the choice she had not made. When she looked back at him, her voice was quiet. And if I let you handle it? Adrian did not hesitate. Then they will not come back. Silence followed. Heavy. Final. Emily stood there, the door still partially open, the line between her world and his clearly drawn. She had not stepped across it. Not yet. But for the first time, she was considering what it would mean if she did. Emily did not close the door. Not fully. Not yet. The space between them remained open, thin as a line drawn with intention, not accident. She stood there, steady, her hand still resting on the edge of the door, her eyes locked on Adrian as if measuring the weight of everything he had just said. Inside, the apartment was quiet. Noah slept, unaware that the world outside their small, controlled space had shifted again. Emily exhaled slowly, not as hesitation, but as decision forming in real time. Nothing comes without a cost, she said finally, her voice calm, even, but deliberate. Adrian did not interrupt. He simply listened. That, more than anything, told her this was not a conversation he intended to win. If I let you handle this, she continued, then it becomes your situation. Your rules. Your outcome. Adrian's gaze did not waver. Yes. Emily nodded once, acknowledging the honesty in that answer. And that means I lose control of it. A pause. Then Adrian spoke, quieter now, more precise. You lose control of the parts that should not belong to you. The distinction settled between them. Not all control was worth holding. Not all responsibility was meant to be carried alone. Emily glanced back into the apartment, just for a second, toward the room where Noah slept. That was her center. That was what mattered. Everything else was secondary. When she looked back at Adrian, something in her expression had shifted. Not softened. Not surrendered. Clarified. I do not need you to protect me, she said. Adrian nodded slightly. I know. And I am not stepping into your world, she added, her voice firm. Not for this. Another nod. No resistance. No push. Just understanding. Emily held his gaze for 1 second longer, making sure he heard what she had not said out loud. Boundaries. Terms. Choice. Then she stepped back half an inch. Not an invitation. Not fully. But enough. Adrian noticed. Of course he did. He did not move forward. He did not cross the threshold. He simply adjusted his stance, respecting the line she had drawn without being told. Then we understand each other, he said quietly. Emily nodded once. We do. Silence followed, but it was different now. Not tense. Not uncertain. It was settled. Like two decisions had aligned without needing to be spoken twice. Adrian reached into his jacket, pulling out nothing, not offering anything new, not adding to what had already been given. Because the card had never been the real offer. This was. Tomorrow, he said, his voice low, controlled, you go to work as usual. Emily did not react, but she listened. You do not change anything, he continued. You do not look for them. You do not respond if they appear. A pause. Then, more quietly, you let me handle the parts that are not yours. Emily considered that, weighing it not against fear, but against logic. Control did not always mean doing everything yourself. Sometimes it meant knowing what not to carry. She gave a small nod. Not agreement to him. Agreement to the decision she had just made. Adrian stepped back then, creating distance again, the hallway reclaiming the space between them. Good night, Emily, he said. No pressure. No expectation. Just acknowledgement. Emily held the door, watching him for a second as he turned and walked down the hallway, his presence fading not because it was weaker, but because it no longer needed to fill the space. When he disappeared around the corner, the silence returned. But it did not feel the same. Emily closed the door slowly, the lock clicking into place with quiet certainty. She stood there for a moment, her hand still resting against the wood, her thoughts settling into something solid. She had not stepped into his world. Not completely. But she had allowed it to stand between her and something she could not ignore. And that was enough to change everything. Because for the first time since all of this began, she was not just being watched. She was being chosen. And that came with its own kind of